And then immediately after that, you went to Harvard.
No, no. I applied to a small university in the Netherlands to read history, but I had decided to take a gap year ahead of any university. And in that gap year, I actually did a lot of things, right? So I started that gap year by walking across the Gobi Desert. So I joined an expedition team to walk across the Gobi, turned 18 somewhere, thousands of kilometers into southern Mongolia.
Wow.
And kickstarted my year doing that. I then started my first business in Hong Kong, which was kind of like a tutoring business, but it was actually a little bit like a prototypical Airbnb experiences. So I built that then, and really I built it because I wanted to pay for my expeditions. I ended up going back to Mongolia, and I lived with nomads for 4 months in winter 2011, and then I finished my gap year by setting the speed record for cycling across Canada.
Jeez.
And so it was an intense year. And in that time, I remember on my way to go live with nomads. And I ended up on a train, the old train before the high-speed rails were open, was 20 from Hong Kong to Beijing. Everyone's like smoking and drinking, playing Doji, the card game. Fantastic time. And I wrote my applications on that train. So I sort of on a whim said, you know what? Let's apply to the US, and I'm going to only apply to the best schools because it's expensive and I don't really have a goal of going, like that was never my goal to just go to an Ivy League.
Welcome to the Little Things podcast with me, Rob Howe. In this episode, I'm chatting with Christopher Schrader, a third-generation Hong Konger whose life blends adventure, entrepreneurship, and a passion for empowering young people. Chris earned a scholarship to Harvard, but not before he walked across the Gobi Desert at 18, set a cycling speed record across Canada, and founded the global nonprofit 24-Hour Race. Join us as we explore identity, ambition, and why sometimes the best lessons come from adventures you didn't plan for. Let's jump into it. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the Little Things podcast with Rob Howe. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure to be here, Rob.
All right, Chris, so let's get started. You and I first crossed paths years ago when my venture firm brought you in as the Hong Kong GM for a portfolio company named Circus. At the time, I remember thinking, damn, this guy's like super sharp, super charismatic, and a bit of a cowboy, honestly. You started the 24-hour race organization. You went to Harvard on scholarship. You left to build an ed tech company, and every so often you disappear on these like insane endurance expeditions to places like Mongolia and Indonesia. But if we take a step back and take it back a little bit, let's talk about your origin story growing up in Hong Kong. What was it like growing up in Hong Kong as a third generation local? And a quick caveat for those just listening to the podcast and not watching on YouTube, you might not realize, but despite being born and raised in Hong Kong, you don't exactly look Chinese.
Yeah, it was idyllic growing up in Hong Kong, I think. My mum was born here. My grandparents had an interesting story, like a lot of the sort of, I guess you'd call them Hong Kong pilgrims, sort of the equivalent of settlers in the States. My grandmother's family had been in Indonesia for some 300 years. She was half Indonesian Chinese and half Dutch, so OG Eurasian. And then my grandfather was kind of a maverick. So my grandmother grew up in a prisoner of war camp because she was born and then the Japanese invaded and the men were separated from the women and children. They went to different camps. So as a toddler, she had I think a fairly traumatic experience. But once the war was over, she and a whole bunch of the Dutch who'd sort of survived through World War II in Indonesia, they all took a boat and they were picked up by random people on the street, literally in the Hague, to sort of quasi-adopted, because it was so chaotic, all of these war victims coming through. And I think she had a sense that she wasn't Dutch. I think, I don't know, but she grew up completely Dutch. She came from a pretty upper class, say blue-blooded family or aristocratic family. But she was Eurasian. She didn't quite look it and fit in. And I think when she met my grandfather and he fell head over heels for her, I think a condition of marriage was we got to go back to the East. And at the time, Indonesia was in the midst of a civil war. Malaysia was in a civil war in all but name. China had a civil war. Singapore was like basically a swamp. And Hong Kong was kind of a sleepy colonial outpost. It wasn't the kind of ripping, roaring financial hub we know of it today. And there was no indication that it would be the case. China was far from opening up as a manufacturing center globe.
Yeah.
So they eloped, basically. They moved to Hong Kong. They got married the day they arrived. And then my mum was born a few years later. And he started as a classic import. export trader. But that's a long way of saying the Hong Kong that I sort of up in the beginning was really the dying days of colonial Hong Kong, I think. So really the 1990s, I think, was a turning point in terms of culture. So, I got this upbringing where there were kids in my classes whose parents were over on, colonial expat packages, the housing's covered, the schooling, all that. Lots of events happening, big party scenes, lots of
Of
activities
course.
as kids of stuff. And then that sort of changed, I think, with SARS. In spite of my upbringing in Hong Kong being basically everything I could ask for, I actually did not have a good time at school. And at age 14, I was expelled from school in Hong Kong and basically told to maybe not apply to other schools related to that particular school. So yeah, so I was a bit of a weirdo or a strange kid, let's say, and I sort of applied to boarding school in the UK without really telling my parents. And, of course, I was like a C/D grade student and nothing notable about me. But there was one school that actually looked at my application. The headmaster personally interviewed me. And he said, he said, there's nothing really on this piece of paper that suggests that you'd be a good student, but I think there's something in you about you. So I'd like to offer you a scholarship to come to my school.
Jesus.
And yeah, that man changed my life. I took that offer and went to a small military school in England for 2 years and sort of whipped up into shape and turned my grades from C's to A's and then ended up coming back to Hong Kong, the prodigal son, and going to a school called United World College. So I did most of my childhood here and just 2 years in the UK, 2 very important years. And then, yeah, I've been here since. And then, of course, I've recently come back and Hong Kong has definitely changed again. I've sort of seen, I think, 3 phases of Hong Kong. And this third phase is uncertain. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So okay, your grandmother was born in what country?
She was born in
Jakarta.
Jakarta. Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
her,
And then
her
she
uncle
moved
was
to
governor of Jakarta.
your uncle is governor of Jakarta.
Yeah,
Okay.
the
So she
Dutch
was
didn't call them governors; they called them directors because if the Dutch East Indies was basically a private colonial enterprise rather than a properly managed colony, if that makes sense. It was more of a business thing.
yeah. So your family came from like the Dutch East India trading roots, huh?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
crazy.
yeah, yeah,
That's insane. So they met in Europe, your
yeah,
grandparents, and
yeah.
then because they wanted to get married and the grandmother is from Asia, they decided to move straight. Did they move to Indonesia or did they move to Hong Kong first?
They moved to Hong Kong, so that was just that was the only place at the time they could move to. And yeah, she was Protestant, he was Catholic. That was a big no-no as well at the time.
Okay. And then your mom came along.
Yeah, she was born to the surprise of no one who knows her in a Typhoon 10 Canosa Hospital here in Hong Kong Island.
That's incredible. So she actually grew up, she was also born and raised in Hong Kong.
Yeah, yeah,
Similar to you, right? Wow.
yeah,
And so I don't, a lot of listeners and audience members may not know, but like Hong Kong is a international city, right? But a lot of the locals, by and far, the majority of locals are Chinese, right? And
yeah,
it's still fairly rare to have grown up as a non-Chinese looking person in Hong Kong. So could you talk a little bit about that? What was that like growing up in
yeah.
Hong Kong for you or even for your mother, right?
Yeah, I think again it would have been hugely different for her. I think there, before the protests in 2019, the population of expats was about 300,000. If you just look at non-Asian expats, so not including India or Indonesia, etc. So when you think of the population of the city being 8 million, it's not even 10, it's not even close to 10%. It's not even 5%. It's tiny. Since then, it's halved. It's 150,000. So a lot of people did leave. Growing up in Hong Kong as an expat, you really live in a bubble. It's not a bad bubble, but you do. I don't speak Cantonese. I never had pressure to. Everybody I interacted with spoke English, and that's even true if I was taking a taxi or just getting around town ordering food. Everybody spoke English, so there was never a pressure to sort of learn Cantonese until actually I left Hong Kong. That's when I first started learning Chinese.
Ironic.
Ironically, yeah, at the age of like 20. So it was idyllic. I have a theory, which is just that these sort of expat colonial, they attract a very particular type of person. So the type of person from England who moves to, say, Hong Kong and works here is not representative of the average English person, right? There's a certain set of traits and characteristics, a little bit of propensity towards adventure, maybe a little bit of disagreeableness. These characteristics, I think, represent some of these outposts. These people just maybe don't fit quite in, and they go overseas. There's this really great Werner Herzog film called Encounters at the End of the Earth. I don't know if you've seen it. And it's Werner Herzog's a great documentarian, and he goes there to film penguins. He loves penguins, and he
Hmm.
ends up stopping in the only city in the Antarctic, and he just interviews random people he finds, and he's like, okay, fuck the penguins. These guys are way more interesting. And he ends up saying with this one interview clip, which I want to say I watched it 15 years ago, but it's stuck with me since. He says, if the world is like people are anchored down, then people who don't have anchors to where they belong or where they were born end up falling down, and they fall to the bottom of the world, and they end up in this city. This sort of deracinated type of person. And I think that's the case for places like Hong Kong. I still remember just one story. When I was maybe 13 or 14, us experimenting with drinks for the first time. We'd go to Lang Kwai Fong, and we'd go get some, probably 1% watered down,
The King
Pepsi with
Roberts.
it. Yeah, exactly. And one time we got caught, and a kid got ID'd, and he presented fake ID, right? He presented his older brother's ID card, which is a really big deal, right? Misrepresenting yourself, it's prison time, almost guaranteed. And one kid goes, "Oh, my dad's a lawyer." That kid calls his dad. His dad calls a judge. Judge calls a police chief. Police chief calls a police officer, and they let it go completely. I don't think that would happen these days, and I also don't think that would really happen if you were local, right? That was real. There's some real privilege, I think, being an expat.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating. I've been an expat, but more in my adult years. But I did go to international school for my senior year of high school in Shanghai, Hangzhou area. And it reminded me a lot of the international students that I met in Hong Kong, who was born and raised in, the HKIS, the Canadian International School kind of environment. And you touched upon, because it's something I'm curious about too. I used to struggle more with my own kind of identity, right?
Yeah,
And this is a topic that you must have thought about
yeah,
endlessly. Given your Dutch ethnicity, your international background, and growing up in Hong Kong, like where have you landed the plane on your own
yeah.
identity?
I think it's actually a real problem is um, deracination. So if you go to an internet now, it's like one of these things where we like to overtly praise diversity, but what diversity ends up looking like is monoculture. And it's only as you get older that I think people start to feel a little bit weird, because if you're like me, Dutch, for example, and you grow up in Hong Kong, and then maybe Hong Kong's no longer home for whatever reason. I'm not Dutch, I go home, I go to the Netherlands, and I love the country, but I'm not Dutch. I don't know the traditions. I barely speak the language. I do feel at home there, but that's a sense of more than a logical explanation. And I think a lot of kids I grew up with have that problem. Especially if they're not in Anglo cultures, right? If they're from, I don't know, mainland Europe, parts of Africa, wherever else, and you basically grow up and it's like kind of metropolitan and cool, and then at some point, like culture and upbringing and values become important to you, and then you don't know where to really look to find them. And I know personally kids who've really struggled to deal with that, and of course I include myself. What's my identity? Well, I don't really have one. Yeah, global citizen, I think, is trite. It sounds stupid. I wouldn't call myself that. Yeah, I mean,
And ironically, now even Hong Kong people might have trouble calling themselves, might have an identity crisis as well, right? So it's getting even incredibly complicated.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I could say I'm a Hong Konger. I don't have a problem with that. But people can also say I'm not a Hong Konger. I don't have a problem with that either. I think, though, there's a really great Stanford historian, a guy called Peter Turchin, who writes about lots of different topics. But one thing he writes about is called ethnogenesis. It's the idea of how are peoples born? Like how does the Dutch become the Dutch, for example, or whatever the ethnic group is. And I can't remember it all, but one of the defining characteristics in ethnogenesis is being surrounded or on the border of a far more powerful country with friction, which kind of accentuates identity differences, right? Because if you're a tiny little state on the border of a much more powerful state, there has to be some more contrast. And so you see this, like a modern day example would be like Israel, right? Israelis didn't exist 70, 80 years ago. Today they do. And you could say that's because they're surrounded by lots of hostile neighbors, much more bigger than them. And maybe Hong Kong's kind of going through that. It has to define itself as a people uniquely. I don't know though. I think that will be really difficult for Hong Kongers because while other empires are pretty violent about suppressing ethnic sectarianism, sectarian conflict, China is much more smart than that, right? So China doesn't really seek to imprison people who are dissidents. It just replaces them, right? It just import a million mainland Chinese, and you don't need to worry about the problem anymore because Hong Kong basically becomes ethnically Han Chinese, for example. And you kind of see that. I mean, the population of Hong Kong, if I'm not wrong, has not changed before 2019 and today. But we know, for example, that 300,000 young Hong Kongers, and I mean locals, left. I mean, under the age of 35, they left in that period. Why the population stays the same, but 300,000 young people leave. Well, who's coming? It's not expats. They've also left. So it's all mainland Chinese moving to Hong Kong, which a different direction. I'm not making a commentary about whether that's a good or a bad thing. I think it's just interesting to observe.
So I went to college, university for a couple years in Hong Kong. And this was back in like '07, and I remember very distinctly that they installed a new ATM machine in the MTR in which it dispenses Chinese yuan. And it's really incredible, right? They're very structured and strategic about how they're going to reintegrate. I'm going to start with cash, right? And then they even uh they had a mandate on how much radio time must be spoken in Cantonese and Mandarin. You remember that? And
Yeah,
then in the old days, all the taxi cabs were speaking in Canto, and slowly you started hearing more and more Mandarin on the radio.
yeah.
It's really intelligent, very sinister a little bit.
It's very subtle. The frog that boils slowly alive, right? Until it's too
Hmm.
late. Hong Kong as well is kind of, you think about so for example, when my grandparents moved to Hong Kong, the population was, I think, less than 2 million, maybe around 1.5 million, maybe even less than that. In other words, my grandparents moved to Hong Kong before most local people lived in Hong Kong. There wasn't like a baby boom. It was mainly disenfranchised mainland Chinese who were moving, right? From all parts of Asia, but also from Shanghai. There was a huge cohort of Shanghainese who moved in. Obviously from Guangdong area in general, they moved in, especially as a result of the Cultural Revolution. So, and then they had to develop their own identity. And I think there is a very strong Hong Kong identity that is in contrast, right, to the place that they escaped from or left. And so they made their identity in contrast to what they saw as like authoritarian, crazy regime. And so then, like, you have a more fragile identity. Well, what separates you? Oh, okay, all right, fair enough, but you can still speak Cantonese. What else is it? Like Char Siu Fa, I don't know, right? There's less and less that separates you basically from your neighbors. Then you just get absorbed, you get swallowed.
Yeah, man. So let's finish off your origin story here because I note that you actually attended and I want to get to how you got into Harvard and then how you left Harvard to start an ed tech company. But before all this, you were actually selected and joined a very select group of schools called the United World College. Could you talk to us a little about what that is and how that led
Yeah.
you into Harvard and beyond?
Yeah, sure. So, Money College was set up originally for the children of senior military officials in the Soviet Republic and in the US or NATO in general, as a chance for them to go to school together. The idea being, if you had to click a button and launch the nukes, it'd be harder. You knew who was on the other side. So it was about bridging gaps through upbringing and education, and the mission expanded where Cold War ended, but the idea stuck, and the idea was, why don't we take people in the last 2 years of their high school life and put them in a boarding school together? Really, just pluck them from their local schools. So you really look for local students from each country. You'd apply, and they put you in a lottery. And so you don't know where you're even going to go. And so I think, by the way, at my UWC in Hong Kong, so I applied and got into my luck, I got into the Hong Kong one, had more nationalities than Harvard had. So I had 150 or 180 students in the school in Hong Kong with something like 90 nationalities. And at Harvard, there was 6,000, and I think there were like 70 nationalities, which is kind of crazy to think, right?
Incredible.
Yeah, so I was really doing well and very happy at my school in the UK. But I didn't come from a boarding school parent. My family aren't boarding school kids, and so my parents missed me, and I missed them, and so I sort of humored my mother. She wanted to. She said, "Hey, look at this school. You should apply." I was like, well, I'm happy where I am. I'll just apply, just humor her. I interviewed, he actually visited the campus, and I was at this very regimented, structured, military school where we had to iron our uniforms and shine our boots until you could see the whites of your eyes. And we were up at 6 a.m. and you're in bed at 9. And I went to this school, and like people were like wearing clothes they clearly hadn't washed in like weeks, and flip-flops. People called their teachers by their first names. What am I doing? This is the opposite of what I'm liking. But it was at the time the number one school in the world for IB results. It was known as just an academic powerhouse.
Jeez.
And I'd done very well. I'd reached my limit at that school I was at in England. If I wanted to push myself further, I probably needed a new environment. So I said, what the hell? I had already made one drastic change in my life, and it had served me really well. So why not make a second? There's nothing here but learning. So I just did it. I took it on. And I remember the first first semester was brutal. I really just struggled to fit in. Felt like a hippy dippy weird place for me. And then after that, I was like a duck in water. I loved it, and really, really thrived there. Made some friends for life. So that's how I ended up there. And then to
How
answer
many
your
years did you
question
go
about,
there?
sorry,
How many years were you in UWC?
just 2 years. So from 2009 to 2011. Yeah, it's just a 2 year
Gotcha,
program,
got.
just the last 2 years before your
And then
university.
immediately after that, you went to Harvard.
No, no. I applied to a small university in the Netherlands to read history, but I had decided to take a gap year ahead of any university. And in that gap year, I actually did a lot of things, right? So I started that gap year by walking across the Gobi Desert. So I joined an expedition team to walk across the Gobi. Turned 18 somewhere, thousands of kilometers into southern Mongolia,
Wow.
and kickstarted my year doing that. I then started my first business in Hong Kong, which was kind of like a tutoring business, but it was actually a little bit like a prototypical Airbnb experiences. So I built that then, and really I built it because I wanted to pay for my expeditions. I ended up going back to Mongolia, and I lived with nomads for 4 months in winter 2011, and then I finished my gap year by setting the speed record for cycling across Canada.
Jeez.
And so it was an intense year. And in that time, I remember on my way to go live with nomads. But I ended up on a train, the old train before the high speed rails were open, was 20 from Hong Kong to Beijing. Everyone's like smoking and drinking, playing Doji to the card game. Fantastic time. And I wrote my applications on that train. So I sort of on a whim said, you know what? Um, let's apply to the US, and just I'm going to only apply to the best schools because it's expensive, and I don't really have a goal of going, like that was never my goal to just go to an Ivy League. And so I did these applications over the course of a few days, and then I spent New Year's Eve in Beijing, and then I basically went to Ulaanbaatar and disappeared for 3 months. No, when I was living with nomads, I had to spend like half a day on horseback to get to the nearest village where they had a phone. There was no
Okay.
internet. There was just literally a dial-up line, and then I would call my Mongolian contact, and he would relay messages that had been left for me. I do that once a week. And so one time I remember going in, and he said, there's all of you, something about anger and whatever. I was like, okay. And I had a satellite phone for emergencies. And so the message relayed was, at this time, please take this call. Um, the time difference meant it was probably about 11 or 12 in the 11 p.m. or 12 a.m. in the night, and it's probably minus 40 degrees outside. And so I had to take this interview. So I walked up a hill to get enough satellite signal, and then I picked it up and I spoke to this frustrated interviewer who was basically like, "We've been trying to get hold of you for a while. What are you doing?" And then I had to calmly explain, actually, I'm living with nomads in Mongolia. I'm sorry, I haven't been connected. And they were sort of confused. They're like, well, we're not really sure how to do this, but like, just message us when you get back. And so that's what I did. I finished my expedition at the end of March in 2012, got to Harvard and a few other universities that wanted to interview me, told them I was back. And then I ended up getting interviewed by, I think, the head of admissions, because I was so late in the process. So I think it was her job to just say yes or no. So obviously they were debating my application, and she was going to make the final call. And it just so happened that she thought my expedition was the coolest thing in the world. So I think that helped
That's
me
great.
massively.
Yeah.
She had so many questions. We ended up interviewing for, I think, 3 hours. She said it was the longest interview she'd ever done. And all she did was ask me about Mongolia and nomads and stuff like that.
Jesus Christ. All right.
Yeah.
So you had the most productive and influential gap year, Probably in history, if I had to
Not something I'm
guess.
ever going to live up to. That's the problem.
That's awesome. All right. So then after that, what happened?
Yeah. So got into Harvard. I remember I got in, and just to tell you like how nonchalant my family was, I think I called my dad up, and he was basically like, "Oh, that sounds good. I'm seeing a patient. Let's talk later." I was like, "All right." And then I called my mom. She said something like, "Oh, that's great. You'll be studying in New York then." And then finally, I had to choose. So I'd gotten into quite a few universities unexpectedly. And the choice ended up coming down between Stanford and Harvard. And I was really leaning towards Stanford, mainly because the idea of wearing flip-flops every day just sounded great. I wouldn't get that at Harvard. And I remember talking to my grandfather about it, and framed the question. Love my grandfather to bits. Framed the question. I was like, "Man, I'm really agonizing about this." And I remember him reading the paper, and he sort of just put it down, cigarette in the mouth, and he was like, looked at me like I was an insane person. Said, "You're going to Harvard." I was like, "I guess I am." I chose Harvard in the end. So I had started in 2000. Well, in high school, I'd started the 24-hour race. And really that was because I'd been doing these expeditions when I was 15, 16, 17. And I had a lot of friends asking me to organize their own. And so initially I would just consult them. I'd just help them put their own expeditions together. And I realized like my insight was, the consensus among adults at the time was, teenagers are lazy. They don't want to do any work, let alone for charity. And we can't even get our kids to do a 3 kilometer walkathon. And my insight was, no, no, you're underestimating how much people want to stand out by pushing themselves. They want to push their limits physically and mentally, and they want to do it in teams. They want to get sweaty. They want to get dirty. They want adventure. All young people
Mm.
want that. And so I wanted to create something that anyone could join to get that experience of really pushing yourself dangerously, right? Really push yourself so that you will be sore and you will be tired and it will hurt. And the answer was like, not genius. 24-hour race, you do a relay race in teams of 8, you get tired, you tag out. If everyone's tired, nobody runs. I mean, it was just not a particularly genius idea. But I think what happened was after pitching the adults this idea and them just saying, we're supportive, but we don't think it's going to work out, I just organized it with students. So instead of working directly with the schools, I would find a student who was at this school and say, "Hey, would you like to be the team captain, put the training together, etc." And that event was intended initially to be a one-off event. Just I'll do it once while I'm in high school. But it was so popular that it ended up being a recurring event. And rather than me directing it again, I just said, "Hey, I learned so much from this experience, like a mini MBA putting this event together. Do other high school students want to do it?" And at the time, a few kids raised their hand. They were the next generation of directors. But the race doubled in size and participation and funds raised 4 years in a row. And it went from 1 country to 3 countries, more or less organically. And it had no registered charity, no corporate bank account. We were doing transactions through third party friends, basically, who were happy to just handle the money. And we were raising millions of dollars. So my idea was to take a couple of months, a semester out, put the board together, hire a professional management team, raise a little bit of corporate funding to pay for all that, and just like standardize and legitimize the race a bit. So that it's actual formidable charity. And I did that. And I ended up working with an incredible team. We had a really wonderful time building this for a year and a half. And at the same time, I was still running my education business, which was doing really, really well. I was making quite a bit of money. And then I made the terrible mistake of raising venture money. I actually ran a cash flow business on a good month in 2000. Remember, this was 2012 or 13. Could make 100,000 net income for me in a month, right?
Fantastic.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I was like 21. I mean, that's a lot of money. And I wanted to put the whole thing online. Everyone was caught up in the hype of software and ventures,
Yeah.
and I didn't have a background in software at all. But I thought, yeah, okay, I was naive. So that venture lasted 3 years and was really it was a failure ultimately, but a really big learning experience for me. And I raised quite a lot of money, at least for someone my age in Hong Kong. I think I raised a total of just under 3 million US, and
Amazing.
built this business initially as a tutoring marketplace, and then eventually as an enterprise learning management platform, and finally as a high skill freelance solution for small companies, small technology companies, which was actually the most profitable, the last stage of the business, back to my roots. And it was very cash flow focused, made a lot of money, but it was too late. I'd raised at high valuations, and I lost a lot of my team at this time. Everyone was furloughed. So unfortunately, it was a failure. It also, I don't think a lot of the lessons, this was ZERP era, right? People were just printing money. Everyone was investing,
Well, money was
so
free back then, if you
yeah,
remember, right?
money was literally free. And so you could be any idiot and start a company. And I guess I was one of these idiots, right, who started a business. And I'm grateful. One of my investors and mentors told me, I mean, a really great guy who I met the first time I told him about my business, and I was raising more money now. And I remember he sat there patiently, listened to my pitch for like 20 minutes. I was like, yeah, fucking nailed it. That was
Yeah.
the best pitch I've given. And he nodded and he said, "This is a terrible idea. You should go back to university and finish your degree." I love a good challenge. So I was like, okay, you believe that. And I would meet him every month and give him an update and tell him where we'd done. And he would say basically the same thing. "Nice to see you, Chris. This idea is shit. Go back to college." And then I think on the fifth or sixth time, he said yes. And he wrote me a check for a quarter million US dollars.
Incredible.
Yeah, and he kind of, he always used to say, "Chris, I'm subsidizing your MBA. This is gonna fail. You're gonna learn a lot, and I'm sure one day you'll
Yeah.
do great things." And it always make me feel a little uncomfortable, right? Like the idea that this guy already knows I'm gonna fail. I'm not gonna fail. I'm gonna build this thing. It's gonna be $1 billion
Yeah.
business. And
What a
of course, it
mentor,
did
huh?
fail, and he was right.
Yeah. 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 But hey, who knows, right? You still have another 50 years in front of you. You're going to be having a dinner with him in 20 years, and he's going to be like, I knew it'd pay off, you know?
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
He's a very special person to me, and I don't think he really would care so. I've realized that I think we have a relationship, and it's a friendship, and it's a mentorship, and it's never really been about the money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you get to meet some interesting people. I mean,
So it's an interesting topic, and I want to. I see it as a Venn diagram. So you have these two worlds. You have your experience with expeditions, ultra endurance, right, pushing your physical limits. But you're also an incredible builder, creator, and operator, and have an excellent mind for business, right, and enterprise. How do these two worlds collide, and how do they kind of complement each other in your experience?
yeah. So I mean, look, we as humans we tend to pattern recognize overly,
Yeah.
but I do see aspects of a venture as a little bit like an expedition. So an expedition is about setting out into the unknown with a goal, and you do plan and you do train and you stock up on resources, and then you start the expedition and it all goes to shit immediately, right?
You miss your
And
flight. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Not even at the start line. Yeah. Um, and of course, you can plan all sorts of routes. You can look at maps, and then when you're on the ground, you realize that there's this uncrossable crevasse or canyon, and you need to refigure out how you're going to get to your eventual goal. So you're constantly having to improvise. And perhaps most importantly, an expedition comes down to its team. It's really an exercise of team. I learned this because I happened to be on a few expeditions that were really poorly led. So the leader was terrible. And I realized, and lots of people maybe dropped out, maybe there were serious injuries on these expeditions. And I realized that what would make or break a expedition had really less to do with people's physical ability, although it had much more to do with your leadership, in particular when things go to shit, and they can go to shit quite quickly. So because I was very young joining kind of elite expeditions, I would have a sort of false modesty. I would always just be the last kid. I would be given the worst jobs. I was not asked for advice, and that's a good thing. No one should ask an 18-year-old for advice on an expedition. But I could observe quietly, like a fly on the wall, what was good and not. And so by the time I led my own expedition, which I was very reluctant to do, lead other people, I only did it for the first time just after I joined you at Circus, right? It's a condition of me joining. That was my first expedition I ever led. I finally felt ready to do it, but it's an exercise in managing egos, managing expectations, and of course unleashing the best of your team in the most challenging, resource depleted circumstances, and of course motivated potentially by fame, but not really much. So you have minimal incentives, you have fractious team members, you have a terrible, oppressive, maybe hostile environment, and you have absolutely zero ability to plan minute by minute. Sounds like a startup, right? Kind of similar.
Yeah.
So that's maybe where the analogy becomes a little more relevant is, a startup is really just a team of people trying to do something, and it's likely that they'll have to iterate and pivot, just in the same way you have to change your route and update your priors on an expedition. And it's a high pressure environment, high stakes, high pressure environment that's not really suited for everyone. How?
Yeah, so I wanted to. There's something I've been thinking about around Trump after Trump got elected and his policies around trying to bring manufacturing back to America. And while I was thinking through this idea and what he's trying to do, it popped into my mind that it's something I want to brainstorm with you and get your thoughts on. So recently, I've been thinking about what is the end goal that Trump is really trying to do. He's trying to, in my opinion, bring back a industry in America to give people stable jobs. Okay, because for a long time America was the country of production. I mean, at least way back, 50, 60 years ago, right? And we've totally lost that, right? But it's not so much that the administration wants to say, hey, go work in like a steel mill or go and make a car. Rather, I'm more interested in the outcome. The outcome is that they want America and Americans to have stable jobs. Okay. And why do they want to have stable jobs? So that they can have consumer confidence, so that they can put their kids through school, so they could potentially buy a house and all that stuff. And maybe, and as well as a national security element, which is, we can be a little less reliant on China, right? But I was listening to a podcast this morning using the same logic, but coming to a different point. So their point is that if the goal is to bring this next great industry or industries back to America for Americans, so this podcast's point is if the goal is to bring back a steady industry for millions, tens of millions of Americans, for the end purpose of helping them um, live a better life in America, then what is the needle mover? And in his opinion, the needle mover is that we should be doing universal health care. For
Mm.
example, the point is because if we had better healthcare, right? And if we had better infrastructure and if we had better schooling and if we can solve a child support for millions of Americans, right? Then you're effectively also solving the same ultimate problem that the average American family is facing, which is they can't afford childcare. And if they had a healthcare issue, they would be cash strapped and they can't really support themselves, right? So it's trying to solve the same problem but coming at both ends, right? Trump publicly, he hasn't thought through this so far, right? He hasn't thought through the whole tunnel. He's just saying, I think Americans need jobs, right? And more power to them because the people in Pittsburgh are also saying to him on the ground, God damn it, I want a job, right? I just want to make $20 an hour. But
Yeah.
if you really think deeply about it, you don't want to make $20 an hour. What you want is for your kid to go to a good school at an affordable cost and buy a house, right? And then one other element to this I want to add, which is I think it's incredibly ironic that Americans are saying, hey, I want to go back to work for a factory. Okay. Because you know who has perfected factories? China. China has perfected factories. And we know, especially you and I, because we have a lot of experience in mainland China, those jobs are fucking terrible, right? They're the most productive factory workers in the world, factory systems in the world. If America were to compete with them to make the same nut, okay,
Yeah.
we would lose.
Yeah.
If we wanted to even be competitive, then our Americans would need to live the similar type of life as those guys, right?
Yeah.
And why would anybody want to be? It's like one of those chicken farms where millions of chickens are crammed into a thing and everyone's blind, right? So I think it's really incredibly ironic.
A few comments on the factory work and that sort of thing. I totally agree with you, but I would offer a little bit of an explanation. The first thing is that America's economy today, just like most Western world economies, is basically fake. A lot of it are
Yeah,
meaningless office jobs, right? I mean, the most extreme example I can think of is London. Okay, so London is really an economy based in the city of London, which isn't even part of London proper, in the financial sector that basically manages money for a lot of very, very wealthy people around the world. And then a services economy in wider London that is basically the UK economy. It's just one city, really just a small cluster of finance guys who are basically funding some services, who are basically funding the rest of the country's services, right? And so a lot of people end up in jobs where they're getting 15, $20 an hour and they're sitting and writing emails all day. And I don't really know if that's fulfilling. What I think, how do we get there? So that's the first question. Is like, how are we in a stage now where most Western economies are what we call service economies? So they're no longer producing goods, they're service economies. Well, you look back to what happened after World War II. So after World War II, we had the invention of the social welfare state. Previously to World War II, If you had a tax, for example, for universal healthcare, it was a flat tax, which the fair way, the inventors of this tax said everybody pays the same because everybody gets the same. So we'll just balance the budget by making it flat. If you don't pay, you don't participate. That's fine. You handle your healthcare some other way. The idea tax, let alone just a tax, to fund institutions is like less than 70 years old as a concept. The idea that the government is responsible for provisioning housing or healthcare or any form of insurance at no cost to its citizens for free, effectively, is also a very new idea. And the idea at the time made sense, I think, for two reasons. Europe was destroyed, had to be rebuilt. America had huge economic output. You also had a massive baby boom, right? People were having 6, 7 kids. And so they were kind of like, okay, well, how do we fund the system? Well, we've got 6, 7 kids who are going to be taxpayers. So we'll just borrow a bit of money. We'll borrow a bit of money. And it turns out that if you were a politician and you said to your constituents, hey, you want free healthcare? You want a free house? They'd vote for you. What
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah, yeah.
surprise. So basically, you had a kind of cynical, in my opinion, group of politicians who took advantage of these new welfare provisions to win elections based on borrowed time, based on borrowing from future generations, which were exponentially going to grow bigger. And of course, what happened is that we had a baby boom, no plural. After that, fertility rate tanked, right? To the point now where across the world, the Western world, there's not a single country with a fertility rate over replacement, over two. So without immigration, they wouldn't be able to maintain their economies. The proportion of people who've basically become dependent on the welfare state has increased, and its associated costs have increased. How is this all being paid for? By either printing money or literally borrowing money. They're two sides of the same coin. It's money that doesn't really exist that you're saying will at some point be productive. Now, what does it have to do with in industrial economy? And your point, we have become overly reliant. We've almost become indoctrinated, I think, to assume that economic health is basically whether the stock market goes up or down.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
And
basically what
most
it
people
comes
don't
down
even
to.
participate in it. You know, the
They don't
middle
even
class have nothing to do with the stock.
Yeah. They have a 401k that they will one day open in 50 years when they retire. And that's their interaction with the stock market. But yeah, generally people don't interact with the markets, and the markets have nothing to do with actual economic productivity. Where I think where I think Trump is right, or maybe his administration is saying something interesting, is that an economy is much more than its GDP output. And so if an economy is reliant on providing, for example, food and goods, manufacturing, et cetera, if there's some sort of global recession or crisis, at the very least, you're provisioning your own economy. You're not sort of dependent on China's industrial output. Then that was really accentuated during COVID, where suddenly everything became expensive, or you couldn't get masks because they were all produced overseas. And so there's a sense that, first of all, not everyone is born and raised and goes, yeah, I can't wait to be employee number 27,500 at this nameless insurance agency where I'm going to work in a corporate park for 40 years and then get a pension. The best day I have is the day I get off, once a month. A lot of people like to work with their hands. They like to produce and build things. I agree with you. I think there's a delta between being really, you know, creative with your body and your hands and like factory work on the line.
Yeah.
For sure, that they're different things. I would argue though that a lot of those jobs are, like also in China, increasingly automated. So if it comes to like really tedious factory work, I think, ultimately as well, there's a kind of trade-off that you've experienced through your own work in the last few years, right? Which is the trade-off is we're going to get things that are cheaper and created in questionable circumstances. So I get cheaper, lower quality shit, and a small Vietnamese child hand sews it for me in an
Yeah.
unregulated environment and like dumps the chemicals in the river next door. That would never fly in the US, but it's okay in Vietnam. So, and it ends up, with this type of regulation, you have to pay adults. You can't hire children. You can't just dump your chemicals into the river. You have to think about worker safety, etc. You don't have to worry about that. Your product's going to be cheaper, right? And so effectively, it's another form of borrowing from the future generation. You're just saying, while these countries are happy to take the money because they're obviously trying to grow their own economies, and cheap for the US is not cheap for Vietnam. But at some point, these people want more than that, right? And at some point, so how can you just continuously, cycle through third world developing countries until what? What happens when they want to do better? What happens when their quality of lives improve? What happens when they want the shoes, which
Yeah.
is kind of where China's getting at the moment?
So let's talk about the future of industrial work and the future of meaningful work for a moment, right? By and far, China is the leader in manufacturing. So if America were to replicate manufacturing or bring back manufacturing, it would be a far shot in hell to compete with China. And more importantly, that's not even the most important part. I think the most important part to me is China for the last half decade and going on for the next 2 decades has already begun heavy work in automating
Yeah.
their factories, as you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
So even at the forefront of manufacturing, they're like, we don't need people. Okay. And now America's trying to say, no, no, no. We need industrial manufacturing in America.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, right, and we think about the future of work, industrial work, and meaningful work, what the hell are Americans and the Western economies going to do if they're
Well,
not going to
they're
be
gonna, Rob, they're
accounting,
gonna do what
service
they're doing.
providers?
They're gonna deglobalize. So the supply chains that we have taken for granted for the last 30, 40 years, relying
Yeah,
on specialized economies producing goods, is going to implode. I think we're at the beginning of the end of globalization period. I think that it's not that China can do it better, it's that it doesn't matter that China can do it better. Because any good that comes into the US is going to be charged 10%, 20%, whatever, 25%. And so it won't make a meaningful difference on whether you produce domestically or not. So you're basically refusing to compete. It's like winning a race by refusing to join the race in the first place.
right, 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 right.
So I,
So
I think I
in
think
that
it's
future,
yeah.
you mean that in the Western economies, are you saying that in 5 years I won't have a $2 battery pack? I won't have a $5 drone, and everybody would just have to get used to a new mix of economy, new mix of consumer products?
I think it would be on a much longer time scale than 5 years. I don't know. I think it's like being addicted to Cheyenne and Taobao is like heroin, right? Or cigarettes. It's hard to get off. So the fact that you can buy fashion, whatever it is, whatever consumer spending you're doing, or literally less than $100, you can get a wardrobe of clothes in one tap on an app. Being the politician who gets rid of that is probably not a very popular politician unless there are meaningful improvements in economic lives, right? And remember, Americans already get pilfered. Like, for example, if you've spent much time in Asia as I have, if you stay at like a dumpster hotel on a freeway or in a major city in the US, you're paying like 350 bucks a night. The sheets aren't clean. You're already getting taken for a ride. Versus if you go to anywhere in Asia, it's 50 bucks a night. Service is immaculate. Everything's clean. So I think a lot of Americans are already sort of being taken for a ride in
Oh,
various
yeah.
different ways. And I think that's that sort of sense of unfairness is what Trump is after. It's not really like, oh, Timmy, I want you to grow up and be a factory line worker. No one, no one's, I don't really think that's the impetus. I think the impetus is like, man, I feel ripped off. I feel like used. I feel mistreated. I don't feel valued. The basic psychology things. And so when Trump comes out and says, well, yeah, this is unfair. People are like, yeah, it feels unfair. I don't know why. It's unfair. And he says, we're going to slap a tariff on it. And he might be right, he might, but for the wrong reasons, it doesn't matter. You shoot it, aiming at a target and you miss, but you hit the target next to it, it's fucking bullseye. Like that's the kind of analogy I think it might happen. In any
These
case,
products, these cheap products
sorry,
that
no,
you
go ahead.
mentioned, these you mentioned that are being supplied from Asia and sold into America is very much like a drug for Americans. And America's corporate, as well as Americans' government over the last 3 decades, have signed this agreement. We will globalize. We will outsource our supply. We will become your world consumer. But how does that square with the concept that in America today, we're a service economy, but service is shit? And
Yeah,
you know what I mean? And more and also, let's say we do this tariffs thing and we block it. Okay, we
yeah,
say everything from the eastern side, we're gonna charge a 50% tariff on it. So all of a sudden, both sides are equal now. Okay, if that's the case, then as an American in America, does that mean that my hotel stays are going to continuously be $500 a night, shitty front desk service, 30% tips, and I won't be able to buy a $10 dress? And I won't be able to buy a $15, battery pack and a $10 drone. So I'm trying to figure out by shutting off the globalization faucet, okay, how does that drive Americans in the Western world to say, I'm gonna go produce quality products at at competitive rates, and I want to increase I wanna lower the cost of service, and I wanna improve service. That's really a $1,000,000 question for me, which is I truly can't understand how America is going to provide better service and provide better products at comparable prices.
I don't think like another way to look at this, if we just put industrial output aside for a second, people in Silicon Valley, where you are, generally where you are, are equally upset by jobs being outsourced to say India or Poland or whatever, right? Like it's not just blue collar work that kind of gets. In fact, one of the principal complaints about illegal immigration in the U.S. is that people will basically undercut prices for domestic workers. So you could see this, like for example, in the trucking industry or in farming, which all require very cheap migrant labor in order to sustain themselves. Although I did see an interesting article the other day that sort of talked about how the prices of apples would change if you couldn't use illegal paid under the table
Oh, yeah.
labor. And it turned out like the price went from like 5 cents a caddy to like 7 cents a caddy. So the difference is tiny. It's not massive for low level, highly automated labor. It's meaningful if you're upper crust New Yorker who wants, your Guatemalan housemaid at $8 an hour. It's not meaningful if you're going to Whole Foods and buying an apple, for example. And look, if you talk about food or goods in general, I think most people would agree that it's better to pay a little more and to ensure that the quality of the goods is high, that people working are being compensated properly and have their own rights, that animals are not being grown in blind cages, factory
Yeah.
farmed. And if that means that we have to pay a bit more, then we have to pay a bit more. I think it's generally what people would say.
So, going back to globalization for a bit, I do agree with you. I think we might be on the precipice at towards the end years of globalization. And that actually makes me feel really curious, but also really anxious. I'm very curious to see what the hell America will look like. You know what I would love? I mean, I don't know if I would love. I think I'm half on it. I think if in 20 years America could look a little bit like Japan, I would be really happy with it. So, for example, Japan, I know they had decades of deflation and no one's growing anything like that, but they had incredibly strong services and products, great service, great products, all locally produced, right? I wonder if America can ever achieve that, and the Western world ever achieve that. That might mean for me, like if I were to zoom in a bit, that means that on my Saturday and Sunday mornings when I go to the local farmers market, a little jar of honey might be $30. It might be $30, but, I don't know. I
Listen,
truly am curious.
you gave a really good example, which is one that I think GDP skeptics often give, which is that on a nominal GDP basis, Japan is like less than half the US, right? In theory, Americans should be happier, healthier, wealthier, whatever. In practice, Japan looks like a pretty awesome place to live,
Yeah,
right? I think the difference is that Japan is a very homogenous place. You have to speak Japanese. You basically have to be Japanese. It's very insular. And America's not. America is a melting pot. There's a bunch of different ethnicities, different people, different backgrounds, different motivations. And so Japan can rely on a sort of homogenous set of values and language practices. Whereas in the US, if you want to do business, if a Palestinian does business with an Israeli, they'll shake their hands, but there'll be an enforceable legal contract, right? Like the capitalism will get them to the table in a way that no peace brokerage could ever do in Syria or wherever. Just rule of the dollar, the US dollar, baby. If we're in it together. They'll do business together. But that's really the contract, the social contract that keeps a lot of American ethnic groups together is money. But you raise a really good point. Japan is basically an autonomous economy. It produces a lot of its food. It produces a lot of its goods, whether that's low level goods or complex goods, everything from very, very high Nikon cameras through to like
yeah,
literal clothing brands and Uniqlo, whatever. So it's a very diverse economy with a huge spread in the complexity of the goods it produces. There is an incredible attention to detail. If you order something from Japan, it's not unusual to see a little handwritten note in there thanking you for whatever you have ordered, even if it's a small pencil sharpener. I don't know. So there's a quality and attention, which I think is very, very much cultural.
I am skeptical because I think a lot of the reason why Japan the way it is and the high level service and dedication is truly cultural. But in America, we're basically the opposite of that.
Yeah.
We pretend to be a service-oriented, friendly country. I mean, we're friendly, but we're definitely not, service providers.
Yeah.
I'll give you a good example. Everybody has super high levels of a standard of living expectations in America. Everybody. In Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and many parts of Asia, if you go to a taxi driver or an Uber driver and you ask them, "Hey, what's something you're looking forward to in the near future?" For the most part, in China, they always say, "Oh, I don't really think that far. I'm just trying to save some money, take it back to the village, buy my wife a house." Okay, that's it, right? In America, my Uber driver is my high school friend, Dave. Like he literally came from the same upbringing as me and you and everybody else. We're all the same, okay?
Yeah.
The person making your burrito is likely also Dave. It's
Yeah.
Matt, okay?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
person driving your car, the person washing your clothes, they all have similar life expectations. And when you ask Dave, "What are you looking forward to this year?" He says, for the most part, and this is not the first time I've heard it, they'll say, "Oh, I'm gonna take the wife to Japan. We always go to Japan every year. We're gonna go to Tsushi market and have sushi." Now, there's nothing wrong with Dave going to Japan or wanting to have that aspiration of going to Japan. The call out I'm trying to make to people is that this is a huge difference between the service providers and the people who are buying the services, the
Yeah.
consumers in America, right? In
Yeah.
many developing and developed countries in the world, the unique mix is that there's different life expectations, right,
Yeah.
between the service provider and whatnot. But in America, that doesn't exist. Everybody's on the same
Yeah.
plane of existence. So I am super anxious, actually. If we cut globalization, what the hell's gonna happen in America? Everything's just gonna get more expensive and things are gonna get crappier,
Yeah.
potentially.
It's you raise a really salient point. Um, the historian I was talking about earlier, Peter Turchin, he also talks about, he has this theory of like successor empires. So he basically says you have a high class empire, high culture empire, and then normally you have a successor empire, which is far more barbaric and violent and militaristic, that
Mhm.
takes over the show and tries to ape and copy its predecessor, the high culture one. So an example would be the Romans and the Greeks. So the ancient Greeks were all about philosophy, math, democracy, city states, that sort of thing. And they were brutalized by the Romans, basically colonized in a very short amount of time. But the Roman elite would import Greek tutors to teach their kids. Their gods were just the Greek gods with different names. Their literature and poetry was based on Greek theatrics and Greek literature and poetry. Another example, Mongolians becoming, in the first place, the Yuan dynasty, right? Basically take over the nomads now. They're like, oh yeah, I'm going to be Chinese. And then we did it again with the Qing Empire, right? Manchurian nomads this time. And Britain was not a violent empire, quite the opposite. It was an empire of culture and mostly commerce, just like the Greeks actually. And the military might of America would dwarf anything that the Brits could imagine. They would have probably thought it was heinous. It was terrible, and yet here we are. And so the argument is that maybe this idea that we could be Americans could be an island locked away from the world and focus on art and poetry and farmers markets is like ridiculous. And actually and the American spirit is indeed imperial in nature and it's Faustian and it wants to reach. And
We're the
so
empire. In Star Wars, we're the empire, right? Yeah, yeah.
maybe the best thing that every other state in the world can hope for is that Americans get really obsessed with Mars. And so they're just going to focus on colonizing Mars, not anyone else. But yeah, I think your point is valid. It's very unlikely that people will just be like, okay, now we're like Japan, and now we have deflationary, so things are affordable and prices are stable, and I can produce my artisanal, miso
Yeah,
soup
yeah.
and bring it to the farms, and I'll be fulfilled by that. When actually, that's like wishful thinking. It's like something that you want, but you should never get because once you get it, you're just going to be disappointed. And actually, Americans need to be dying on the battlefields of Mars, fighting for the next piece of land or
They say
industry or whatever.
they
You want to know something crazy? A statistic I read the other day. Don't quote me on it because I can't remember the exact numbers, but the point will be made in any case. But it was something like 50% of Americans will be in the 1% at least 1 year in their lives.
1% of what?
Income.
Wealth?
So
Income.
you
Holy
always
shit.
talk about the 1%. in terms of income, right? 50% of Americans at 1 year of their lives will be in the 1%. That's a higher social mobility than pretty much any country in the world. Pretty much, I don't think there's a country in the world with that sort of mobility. It's wild.
That's great, Chris. Well, I think we'll call it here tonight. I really wanted to thank you for your time for joining me on the podcast. I thought it was a super interesting conversation. So thank you
Yeah,
again.
same. Thanks for having me.